Welcome, everyone. Welcome, welcome. You can wait.
You're learning the joys, I think, of
Yeah.
learning these things.
My earliest class is 10:45 a.m., so I can be here all night.
Don't say that.
No.
I'm old.
All right. Well, I'll begin. Thank you guys for joining us for the past 3 lectures. For our lecture series, Russell Kirk at 100, A Conservative Mind's Legacy. We really appreciate it, and as I'm sure all of you know, Russell Kirk was deeply involved in Hillsdale College and in the American Studies program here at Hillsdale, and we're glad you can celebrate with us. Today, Dr. Birzer will be speaking on the life and legacy and also work of Dr. Russell Kirk. Dr. Birzer holds the Russell Amos Kirk Chair in History here at Hillsdale College and is currently a fellow at the McConnell Center at the University of Louisville. After having earned his BA at the University of Notre Dame in 1990, Dr. Birzer took his PhD to Indiana University in 1998. Dr. Birzer is also the co-founder and senior contributor to The Imaginative Conservative and a fellow at the Reagan Presidential Library. Dr. Birzer has authored several books, including his award-winning biography of Dr. Kirk, Russell Kirk, American Conservative, J.R.R. Tolkien's Sanctifying Myth, American Cicero, Charles Carroll of Carrollton, and his newly released book, In Defense of Andrew Jackson. I suggest that you all go out and buy it after this talk is over. Today, Dr. Birzer will be speaking with us about the life and work of Dr. Russell Kirk. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, everyone. This is great. I didn't know if Annette was going to stop talking back there, so I told Isaac these are the joys of running things. So thank you all. This is great that you're all here. And I've got a couple of things that I do want to talk about tonight, but I also want to thank some people. This is only the second time that I've met Alan, though we've known each other for a long time, mostly through correspondence, so it's great. I love the stories today. It's absolutely fantastic. And I've got to hear more about the canoe. But it did sound really good. And Gleaves, of course, is a very long-time friend. In fact, I never would have gotten too interested in a lot of things that I'm interested in now, especially Christian humanism, without Gleaves really having introduced that to me almost 20 years ago. And it was, strangely enough, I was a very hardcore libertarian in high school and through most of college. And right out of college, I went to Denmark for 3 weeks. And the Intercollegiate Studies Institute had just issued a very, really not attractive journal called the Intercollegiate Review. I mean, what was inside was fine, but the outside, it was this strange kind of fuchsia pink on it. And I was on the plane, I was a little embarrassed. I was reading this pink magazine. But inside of it this was 1991, and inside of it was a fantastic article by Gleaves Whitney. I'd never heard of him. And it was really my great introduction to the idea of cultural conservatism. And I credit Gleaves for that. And it also made the transatlantic flight much nicer, except for the pink thing. But other than that, it was a great article on decadence. In fact, his talk that he gave yesterday was very similar to the article that I read and had a great privilege of reading back in 1991. So that was really nice, and it was good to see that. And I want to thank Isaac, and I want to thank Caitlin, and everything. Kevin Porteous is not here tonight, but American Studies and Delta Pi Nu. It's been a long time since I've been involved. It was kind of our life from 2005 to 2009. So it was a lot then, and it was great, but we haven't had much to do with it for 10 years. So really glad to be back and to have that. We even had back in 2005, we had a full 2-day Russell Kirk seminar where we just explored his idea of academic freedom. And that was great. It was a while ago now. I was much younger. My hair was probably shorter, and it certainly had more color. But anyway, that was a great time. And that came. We really, really enjoyed talking about that. Dr. Arnn spent the whole 2 days with us, so it was really nice. But most of all, I want to thank Annette. And I'm sure if any of you have had a chance so far to meet her, you've discovered that she's an incredible force of nature. She talks and talks and keeps talking. And I always joke that whenever I'm out speaking about Russell Kirk, that I know somewhere Annette is talking to somebody. And I hope you get a chance to talk to her. She's incredible. in all kinds of ways. And Annette, seriously, I just, the fact that you opened all the papers up to me, that you allowed me to explore Kirk and to get to know him for 5 years as I was writing the book, it's just one of the greatest honors of my life. So thank you for all of that. And I hope you got a chance to notice, as Deidre said, I think during questions, that Annette is every bit as interesting as her husband. And yet she's dedicated her life since he died promoting his image. And she, in and of herself, is worthy of several books and has done so much for the conservative cause over the last quarter century and before that as well. So I hope you all recognize that. It's great that she's given herself over to her husband's legacy, but her legacy is equally as strong, I think, in every kind of way. Okay, so there was a time that I didn't know Annette Kirk, and that seems odd to me. In fact, I met Annette about the same time I met my wife. I don't think there's any coincidence in that, or maybe there is, I'm not really sure. But I had never known Dr. Kirk, and I regret that. I was alive, certainly when he was alive, and I had finished college in 1990. He passed away in 1994. I went to Notre Dame. I could have driven up to Mecosta. In fact, I had a very close friend, Heidi Heminger, who did drive up to Mecosta during those years, and I didn't make the connection. And I'm sorry, because I never had a chance to meet him. And I do think that helped me when I was writing the book. It gave me a certain objectivity, maybe. But I can also say that I started reading Dr. Kirk in 1989. In fact, I was reading The Conservative Mind. I still have my copy. It's 3 blocks away at our house. But I started reading The Conservative Mind right as the Berlin Wall was falling. And that same fall, it was an amazing fall in all kinds of ways. I was pretty upset that Reagan was no longer president, but of course that was inevitable, right? He had to step down after his 2 terms, and I certainly wasn't ready to amend the Constitution even for a 3rd term for Reagan. But if anybody deserved it, I think maybe he would have. But there was a lot of troubling times at that point. There was a lot of greatness too, but I think back to the fall of 1989, and as I was watching everything collapse in Europe, it was annus mirabilis as all of that was happening, truly a year of miracle. As I was watching that, I had Kirk giving me a sense of order in his conservative mind. And I think that helped a lot. It allowed me to see what was going on. It allowed me to make sense of events that were going on in the world. So, incredible. And I think about that now. I've been thinking about Russell Kirk for 29 years of my life. And that's not half of my life. That's more than half of my life at this point. And that's pretty stunning as well. And so I've been thinking about him very seriously for a long time. And he's certainly, even though I never met him, he has always been somewhere in my imagination, in my understanding, and he's one of my great heroes. The thing that I like most about Kirk is not what I'm going to talk about tonight, but I hope you also got a sense of this, not only listening to Alan, but listening to Annette. The thing that strikes me most about Dr. Kirk and Annette is not all of the writings, it's not everything that they did in terms of the conservative movement, it's the way they lived their lives and the way that everything that Dr. Kirk made, they gave away in charity. They helped the homeless. They helped all kinds of women who were in trouble in Grand Rapids and elsewhere. They really, truly lived out exactly what they professed. We all like to profess and believe. They lived it. And I can never fault them in any way for that. I really do think, without exaggeration, that there is a very, and I know Annette will hate me saying this, but that there is a saint-like quality to their relationship. And I think they were, in the best sense, they were the ultimate power couple of their day. Not like the Clintons, because they're good, right? So it's there's a difference there. But it's still, in terms of charity and living out their lives, they really were the great examples for all of us. And they did live that out in every way. So I just think that's a beautiful statement. So one of the first times I met Annette, I don't know, Annette, if you remember, we were in Philadelphia and we were in a car together driving around, and I started just pelting you with questions. And I actually still feel guilty about that to a certain degree. Any of you who know me know that I never run out of things to say. And I just started asking her everything. And I've got, my brothers are like that too, and my mom were just really obnoxious. When we meet people, we like it. We want to know everything about them. And so I just grilled Annette about all kinds of things, and amazingly enough, she took it. And she invited me to come up to Mecosta, and I came up to Mecosta, and I asked her another million questions. And there were times, this is late for me, by the way. I'm usually, by 8 o'clock, I'm ready to go to bed. And Annette, though, you can be at her house, it could be 3 or 4 in the morning, she's still going strong. And so I'm not exaggerating about that. I would try to keep up with her, but even I, with my billion questions, started waning around 11 o'clock. That's when she would start pulling out the hard liquor at that point. And you never knew what was going to happen then. But anyway, I mean, really amazing. So here's one of the things that she told me. And this was actually at a Liberty Fund conference we were at together. And I was asking her more questions. And I think actually one of the reasons she finally allowed me to look at all the papers and write the biography is so I would shut up. I'm pretty certain that was a part of it, at least. And I remember asking her, tell me about your relationship with him. And that was not something we had talked about up to that point, really at all. She told me stories. I knew the story of how they met. I knew about the car crash. I don't know if you guys know about the car crash. I knew about these various things. I knew about them writing to one another and their courtship, but I'd never really heard how they interacted with each other. And Annette responded without a pause. She said, Brad, you have to understand something. Every single thing Russell touched became magical. And I thought, that's incredible. Just think about that. Everything he touched became magical. And I can't but hear the stories and think about that. And it was really, that was in the forefront of my mind as I was writing the biography. And I didn't want to make him a saint, and at the same time, I couldn't help it. It was all there. The humor, the intelligence, the charity, everything was there. But when Annette said that to me, it made sense. That is what Russell was like. He's one of these guys, no matter how much evil came into his life or how much bad, he made it good. And as Annette said, he always, no matter how much he might lament where the modern world is, he always recognized there was hope, always. In fact, one of his greatest articles was an article he wrote right when President Reagan became president, and it was called The Audacity of Ronald Reagan. And he ends his speech, it was a speech he gave at the Heritage Foundation on Reagan, and he ends it by saying, you have to understand the virtue of hope always exists. If you really believe in the virtue of hope, it can never disappear. We can forget it, we can ignore it, we can mock it, but it is always there. And all you have to do is remember hope exists for hope to arise. And those are very profound and deep thoughts, I think, in ways that maybe we could sum it up in a refrigerator magnet, but it still has great weight. And that, for me, is Russell. So when I started writing the book, I desperately wanted to start the book with all of his charitable activities. And I knew everybody who read the book would just put it down. Nobody would believe it. It's too much. How much he helped people, how much Annette helped people, the things they did for educational reform, the things they did for Mecosta County, the things they did in Grand Rapids. It's too much. We can't handle it. And so I put it at the end, and it became the conclusion to the book. And the reason I did that was purely strategic. I had to build my case. Even though I knew it was true, you can't start off a book by saying, this is the coolest person you will ever meet in life. Even if it's true, no one will believe it. But I think, and this for me, if anything is remembered about my book, if anything's remembered about Dr. Kirk, and I think there will be many things remembered, it's his example of living the Christian life. That, for me, is what is so telling about his person and his short 75 years, way too short, on this earth. So what I want to do tonight, I brought some fun, those of you who know me knew I was going to do this, but I brought some items for show and tell that I'm going to show you, some things that I want you to know about, especially with Dr. Kirk and who he was. And I want to make 2 points tonight. And that's it. I won't go too long. I just want to make 2 points. I'm going to read to you a little bit from Dr. Kirk. Number one, I want you to understand, as Annette told us today, that the ultimate manifestation outside of charity of any one of us being conservative is to release our imagination. This was central to almost everything Dr. Kirk argued. It's in the conservative mind, even if he's not explicit about it. One of the reasons he picks the 29 people he picks in the conservative mind is because each of them had an imagination that somehow revealed something that others around them had not understood. So if we look at it as merely a pantheon, we're going to misunderstand what the conservative mind is about. It is the story of disparate individuals, often people who resented one another and disliked one another, but they each in their own way understood a particular truth. And that's why if we look at the conservative mind and try and find a program, if we try and find a party platform, if we try and find answers to how to be a good Republican, we're not going to find any of that. what we find in there is an expression of the individual human person and the goodness of that person. And for Kirk, that can only really come when we understand what the imagination is. But the second thing I want to mention, and I want to show in kind of a bizarre way, I think, but also a wonderful way, how this manifested in Kirk's own life, I want to talk a little bit more than Annette did about his fiction. And I want to look at some of the things that he expresses. And one of the reasons I want to do this, partly because I love fiction, and partly because he was good friends with Ray Bradbury, and it's October, and we've got to think about Bradbury, and we have to think about Kirk, because it's October. But I also want to do it because I think when we look back on Kirk's legacy, aside from that incredible charity, maybe 100 years from now, I really do believe his short stories, while not at the level of Flannery O'Connor or Ray Bradbury, are only a step below. I think that Kirk will be remembered much for his fiction 100, 200 years from now. He won't be a major player, but he will be a player. People will study him, and especially to understand the format of the short story and what it meant in the way that we read Hawthorne's short stories or O. Henry's short stories. And I'll try and explain what I mean by all of that. So the first thing I want to do is we think about his imagination. I want to look back to his speech, and Annette quoted from it today. I was actually a little worried. We hadn't talked to each other, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is everything I'm going to talk about tonight. And I could have switched if I needed to, but this is stuff I really wanted to talk about. I want to read to you from an address Kirk gave in a building that doesn't exist anymore, right over here. Gave a talk over in Phillips Auditorium in the fall of 1976. So this was a speech he delivered here. And it was a speech at the time that he called Images and Imagination. Later, he retitled it The Rediscovery of Mystery. But any of you want to look it up, it's one of the great addresses at Hillsdale. We have it both on video as well as online. You can pick this up at any time. And I find it absolutely central to understanding what Dr. Kirk was arguing in all kinds of ways. So I'm not going to quote, the thing is long. It was a very long speech that he gave at his CCA. It was the second CCA that year that he gave it. But remember, this is fall of 1976. Things were pretty gloomy in America for the most part, even in that bicentennial year. So Kirk very intentionally gives us hope in what he's trying to say, and at Hillsdale in particular. He says at the beginning of the essay that we have to understand with G.K. Chesterton that the only way we really understand enduring truths is by seeing them in parable, story, and myth. So this is why, of course, when we look back at the greatest of storytellers, the great Nazarene, why he mostly spoke in parables, stories, things that we would remember, because that kind of armor, that kind of shell that we put around the story, it keeps with us. We know that there's something important about the story of the lamb, about the story of the sheep, in ways that maybe we don't remember quite all the specifics of Matthew's, the speech that Jesus gives, the Sermon on the Mount, but we remember the stories. These are credible ways of thinking about what Christ was telling us. So Kirk says we have to think like G.K. Chesterton. That is, if we remember, if we pass on our legacy, it must be through parable, story, and myth. And through this, we all understand, Kirk said, that we are all made in the image of God. We breathe only because the divine allows us to breathe. The saint, Kirk wrote and said here at Hillsdale, is a human being who has put down his vanity and who really does love God with all of his heart, all of his soul, all of his mind, but he also loves his neighbor as himself. It is never possible to know God unless one first knows himself. We can't proceed otherwise. Instead, one must proceed from the microcosm, us, to the macrocosm, God, and then we will understand the little human image that is part of a transcendent reality. And then Kirk says something stunning. He says, you must understand that every single human being who has ever existed, past, present, and future, is a form of God's utopia. Now just think about the profundity of that for a moment. We are all made in the image of God, and yet not one of us looks alike. We're all individuals, we're all distinct, but God is infinite. So when he creates with the Imago Dei, that stamp he gives us will never be repeated, even though we're in the human envelope. And so we see that universality. So for us to understand the Word, we have to understand the little words. We have to understand us as made in his image. So Kirk says, how do we do that? How do we approach it? How do we put forth our own understanding of what conservatism is, and why do we rely on the image? Kirk is very taken. I think this should be obvious. He's very taken with St. John. He's taken with the whole idea that St. John gives us, of course, taking it 600 years old at that point from Heraclitus, the concept of the Logos, the image, the divine fire. John 1:9, the light that lighteth up every man. This becomes central to Kirk's understanding. And so when we are to understand ourselves, we have to understand the image that is projected from God into our souls. This is how we relate. This is how we communicate with God. This is how we pray. We recognize that image. So Kirk says, images are one of the most powerful things we can ever have in this world. Images, he says, are representations, necessarily. They have to be. Right? The image is a reflection. It's a representation. What? For mere words are tools that break in the hand, and it never pleased God that man should believe that he could be saved by logic or abstract reason. And this is not God's intent for us, and yet we know the image is incredibly powerful. But what can we do with free will and our human agency? Of course, we can degrade the image. And imagine how often we do that. We do that in my day and age. I don't think they have these much anymore. Catalogs, the way they sell goods, the way movies are sold, the way covers of books are sold. The image is everywhere distorted in our world. And so should we really be surprised that if we're willing to distort the image of, say, a 13-year-old girl, why would we not distort the image of everyone in society? Why would we not distort the image of God himself if we can't even understand how powerfully we reflect his divine word, his divine will? So Kirk cautions. He says we must be very careful with images. For the image, I repeat, can raise us on high, as did Dante's high dream, but it can also draw us down into the abyss. So the image matters. It is a powerful thing that it, in and of itself, though good, can be distorted and can be maligned for evil. Kirk reminds us. He says, with proper images, the spirit is uplifted, and it can liberate us from the failures of the flesh, but only if we submit ourselves to that which is good. When we submit ourselves to evil, we will understand that we will become what we admire. So if we only look at the evil image, the distorted image, think about C.S. Lewis and that hideous strength, the picture of the Last Supper, where we have the young man, Mark Studdick, staring at that picture as he's being interrogated. And he sees something's not quite right. And then he recognizes that the feet of all the men at the Last Supper are made out of the images of rats. And this is the disturbing. There's the image from afar. It's the Last Supper. But up close, you see how much this has been distorted. Or think about what we might do with a Picasso. Think about how the image, multiple forms, showing up in multiple different ways, the image of the human face distorted in some way. These are images, Kirk says, we must beware of. For no matter what, no matter how good we might be, no matter how much we might choose good, when we see evil, we must understand, as Kirk said, that our will is free only within limits. So, the image matters. Kirk says, it is true of the great philosopher and of all science and of poetry that the image is the first thing we see, and then we must follow from that. So the image is important. Now remember again, where is the image from? This is the idea that St. John gives us in his gospel. This is the idea of the Logos, the idea of us reflecting the Imago Dei, as we see in Genesis as well. So a very critical understanding of how we can think about the human person. Okay, so I've got to show you, I've got my little, take a break here for the heavy ideas, and I will show you my fun things. So, Dr. Kirk, in his lifetime, not only wrote very good history and literary criticism, he also wrote a lot of short stories and 3 novels. So he wrote 3 novels and he wrote 20 short stories, all of which I think are excellent in all kinds of ways, but they're varying degrees of excellence. Some are better than others, to be sure. But I want you to see the kinds of things that Kirk published in. This is number 11 of the London Mystery Magazine. Kirk had published in number 4 That was his very first major story. He actually earned a lot of money in the spring of 1949. He was a grad student for this. His second story was this one that he published here in the London Mystery Magazine. Again, was able to put himself through several months of grad school through the payment. In America, he was publishing in magazines like this, called Fantasy and Science Fiction. And there, you can't see it from where you are, but right on the cover, they list the two great authors who appear in this issue, Isaac Asimov and Russell Kirk. That's not something we generally think of when we think of Russell Kirk, the great founder of post-war conservatism. And then it gets even a little bit weirder. Here's one of Kirk's novels, published in the 1960s. It's kind of scandalous if you look at the cover. I'm not sure Kirk approved of this image, but there it is. This is a little book called Lost Lake. It's an Avon paperback, very cheap, probably sold at the time, well there it is, 50 cents, right? Not much at all. And it's got a woman running from a castle. She's obviously a damsel in distress. What would we call this? It's Pulp Fiction, isn't it? Absolutely. This is Pulp Fiction. Kirk was really good at it. It gets weirder. Anybody see that? It's one of my favorite things that hardly anyone knows that Kirk published. It's a book, not by Kirk, but by an occult writer by the name of Brad Steiger. And Kirk wrote the second chapter in it. The book is called The Strange Powers of ESP. I'm sure you're all going to run out and order this, right? We all want to know how we employ ESP. But chapter number 2, written by Russell Kirk, A History of the Ghosts at Piety Hill. He takes it very seriously, and it's a fascinating article. In fact, it gets into serious theology about purgatory, about the idea of how do we understand the incarnation. So it's not just a ghost story, it actually has real meaning. I had a chance when I was writing the book on Kirk to write to Steiger. I said, why'd you contact Kirk? Are you a conservative? He said, no, I'm not really political. I just knew Kirk was really into this stuff, and a friend introduced me to him. And so I asked Kirk to submit a chapter. He submitted a chapter, I printed it. And there it is. So how many of you know this? 1966, 1967? What happened over in the Arm? Anybody know the history of this? There was a UFO in the Arm. Kirk loved this. We have reports the government sent officials out to investigate it in 1967. Project Blue Book in the Air Force, and they dismissed it. It was the first time a UFO was ever classified as being the result of swamp gas. Those of you who live in Olds, do you feel like there's a swamp right behind you? They chased that UFO all the way down the road. In fact, they chased it out into the country. I don't know what happened. I can't explain it. Kirk loved that stuff. That was just high candy for the imagination, right? Absolutely. All right, so 2 more things I have to show you. The year's best horror stories, featuring the work of Stephen King and Russell Kirk. Anybody know Russell Kirk published with Stephen King? It's pretty cool. And the last thing I have to show you, this brings together almost all of my loves in every way. The World Fantasy Awards, featuring Stephen King, Ray Bradbury, Harlan Ellison, and Russell Kirk. And the painting is done by Roger Dean, who painted all the great rock albums in the early 70s. Kirk has the same cover artist as Yes did. That's awesome. That is great. Everything comes together. Conservatism, progressive rock. It's incredible. So, here's what I want to point out. And I hope that you guys realize this, because Kirk is not just a conservative. He's an imaginative conservative. And that's different from just being a conservative. So I want to give you just a couple people who loved Dr. Kirk's writing. One guy that none of us remember anymore, he was an agent and a pretty respectable publisher in his day, a guy by the name of Oscar Collier, wrote a book in 1986 in which he explained and argued, and I think convincingly, that the entire genre of modern horror fiction came from Dr. Kirk's first novel, The Old House of Fear. And he shows that prior to that, there were books that were being published about ghosts and gothic horror and werewolves and monsters and so forth, but it was Kirk who made it respectable, in the same way it was C.S. Lewis and Ray Bradbury who made science fiction respectable. That's an interesting argument to make, and Annette can back me up on this. That book, Old House of Fear, sold more books than every other book Kirk wrote combined. It sold over 1 million copies. It was in print for 17 years and went through something like 13 different editions. Now, anybody in here read it? Besides Mrs. Kirk and Alan, right? It's actually a fun book. It's not great. It's not the best thing I've ever read, but it has a lot to it. And we see Kirk, pre-Manfred Arcane, demonstrating that the nerd can get the girl in the end, as long as he wipes out the commie who's controlling a Scottish castle, right? If you can do that, you get the beautiful woman, you get the castle, and you get all the money, right? And then you get to live and write books for the rest of your life. Jerry Purnell passed away just a few years ago, one of the most famous science fiction writers of his age. Purnell said Kirk was one of the greatest men, greatest writers who ever lived. Purnell actually wrote his master's thesis on Kirk, and then went off and worked for the government and did all kinds of things with fiction. Edmund Fuller, the ultimate literary critic for the Wall Street Journal, praised Kirk as one of the greatest writers in his fiction of his day. Harlan Ellison. Am I dating myself now? Anybody remember Harlan Ellison? He just passed away last year. Ellison is one of the most obnoxious people I've ever read. If any of you ever watched the original Star Trek, he's most famous for having written the episode where Kirk goes back to the 1930s and has to let the social worker die. So the Nazis, it always comes back to the Nazis, right? They have to be defeated. And it's a great episode called On the Edge of the City Forever. Incredible. Harlan Ellison loved Kirk's fiction. Harlan Ellison is a radical atheist liberal, but he thought Kirk was one of the best writers of his day. That's the reason Kirk won the best short story of the year in 1977 for a short story called There's a Long, Long Trail, a Winding, because Harlan Ellison said it was the only book worthy that year, the only story of the greatest award in fantasy. Kirk won that. It's pretty great. Stephen King. I know as conservatives we don't like Stephen King, but you have to give the guy credit. He knows how to write, and he knows how to imagine things. In 2010, he was asked, what are the 100 most important books written in the last 60 years? And of those 100, he listed Kirk's collection of short stories, The Princess of All Lands. It's pretty impressive. That's a nice resume to have. And yet, we barely remember Kirk as the fiction writer. So let me finish with this. I brought in the same book that Annette did earlier, but I don't have my cover anymore. Ancestral Shadows, a great collection of Kirk's short stories. It's missing a few. It's not complete, but it's very good for what it is. Very good. It's the best collection, really, at this point that exists when we're looking at his fiction. So I hope we can get another edition and get everything in there at some point, but not yet, right? That's not there. Maybe one of you can do that someday. I'm going to finish just by reading from my favorite story of Kirk's, by far, and that is this one that won the National Award in 1977. It's been reprinted in so many different collections and books, simply called There's a Long, Long Trail, a Winding. Now this is based on a real person. This is based on a man who lived with Annette and Russell, who was a convict, who was on parole, and Annette and Russell took him in. A guy by the name of Clinton Wallace, who Annette can tell you fascinating stories about him. His ability to remember things, his ability to recite poetry, fascinating figure. And any of you who ever drive up to McCauston and visit St. Michael's Cemetery, Clinton Wallace is buried right next to Dr. Kirk. In his tombstone, doesn't say professional hobo, which is what he was in that day and age. It says he was a knight, K-N-I-G-H-T, of the road. That there's that magic that Annette told us about. Everything Kirk touched in some way became magical. Even an ex-con from New York who was probably so lost in this world in all kinds of ways. Here is Annette and Russell taking care of him. He accidentally burns their house down in Ash Wednesday of 1975. They still keep him. You guys were probably not happy, right, at that point, but Clinton stayed, even though he had wanderlust and he would take off. So he appears in 2 of Kirk's short stories. And his name in these short stories is Frank Sarsfield. And the story is true. He gets in and out of prison, and at one point, he's able to catch a glimpse of what the prison psychiatrist wrote about him. And the prison psychiatrist says, this is an incredibly intelligent man who keeps his head down so he won't get beaten up. He keeps to himself, but he is much smarter than anyone has ever given credit for. And yet, I worry, he says, that there's something in this man that would remind one of a Viking berserker. And Frank reads that, and he's confused. He's a gentle man. He's a gentle giant. How could I be a berserker? You guys know what berserkers are? Those who were given the honor of going first into battle before the whole militia went out. They had the honor because they had been touched by the divine. They were mad, and they would go out with their axes, single combat, and challenge the enemy. And of course, they would be the first to be cut down. But it was a great honor to be that berserker in Viking culture. So here's this guy, this gentle giant, who has this in him. And he's pondering, what does this mean for me? And he writes to his sister at one point by the name of Mary, and this is what he writes. He says, by the way, Mary, once upon a time when I was talking to Father O'Malley, he told me that to the Lord, all time is eternally present. Now just think about that for a moment. This is the story that the great atheist, leftist, obnoxious man, Harlan Ellison, said was the greatest story of 1977 and gave him the award for best short fiction in science fiction. So here we have it. We've got this ex-con talking about God and God's vision of us. All time is present to God. Because of course God's outside of time. He can see at any moment he wants to. He can insert himself in any moment he wants to. Past, present, and future. He's the author of everything. So here's this ex-con dwelling on this. What does that mean? So to the Lord, all time is eternally present. I think this means everything that happens in the world in any one day goes on all at once in God's mind. So God sees what went on in this house long ago and what's going on in this house today all at the same time. It's just as well we don't see through God's eyes, because then we'd know everything that's going to happen to us. And because I'm such a sinner, I don't want to know what I'm going to do. Father O'Malley says, and this is beautiful in every way, that God may forgive everything I've ever done, and most likely will. But I don't understand why God would do that. So Father O'Malley says to me in response, maybe some people actually work out their purgatory here on earth. And maybe I've been blessed to be one of those people. He says that we are just spirits in a prison house of the body, which is like we were serving time in the world here below, and maybe God forgives me long ago, and I'm just waiting for my time and paying for what I did, and it will be all right in the end. Or maybe I'm being given some second chance to set things right. But as Father O'Malley put it, I would have to do something to fortify my will. Maybe I will have to contribute some signal act in the world. And he's perplexed. There's that berserker element. And so the story goes on, and he finds himself in an upper room of a mansion, a deserted mansion, but it's not deserted. He can hear little girls crying several floors below. And then he can hear footsteps coming up as he hears explosions outside, and he hears the screams of these girls asking, begging for help. And he thinks immediately, escape. He opens the window and he looks out. Can I get on the roof? Can I get to the tree? Can I get out of here before I get involved in something I don't want to be involved in? He's a coward. And then a little girl knocks at the door. Frank, we need your help. Come. And he opens the door and he says right then, it was only this little girl that gave me the grace to be brave. It's so cool. He goes down the stairs, and as he does, there are a number of escaped convicts who have raided this house, and they're holding the wife and the little girls hostage. And as he comes down the stairs, one of the prisoners is coming up. They recognize him. They were all cons together. They recognize him. He's got this battle axe, and he swings it at Frank, and Frank's huge, and he grabs the axe. And as he does, he grabs the man's throat, he breaks his neck. The con falls down, and Frank runs down to the bottom floor. And here are all these convicts staring at him. And the next thing we know, they're all Frank has severed all their heads. He's gone berserker. He's lost. He sees blood splattered all over the wall, but the little girls aren't there. The mom's not there. What happened? How could he have killed all these men? How could there be blood everywhere? How could he have gone berserker and for no reason? And he crawls out of the house, and he crawls through the snow, and he sees a monument in front of the house. And the monument is to him because he saved the lives of these little girls. But it's dated 100 years earlier. That's his purgatory. And that is Kirk's genius at showing how these things work, understanding that all time is present in God's mind. And an act of grace is not necessarily in 2018 or 2019 or 2020. It's all the time. Grace surrounds us at every moment. And there's Frank, that one horrible tendency he has. He could be a berserker, but he uses it at exactly the right time to protect the innocent. That's the magic. That's the grace. It's not that the berserkership was good. It was that it was turned to good because of heroism and because of grace. And that, when Annette tells me that everything Russell touched became magical, I see that in everything he did. Nothing in this life was what it seemed. He made everything better. Every person he saw the best in them. Even the homeless, the derelict, the ex-cons, he could see in them goodness. How many of us do that in this present age? How many of us want to be like Frank and get out as quickly as possible before we get mixed up in a bad situation? Kirk tells us, in the end, all we have is the decision we make right here and right now. And that happens every moment of our lives. God gave him 75 years, and he made a lot of good decisions. Every one of us has benefited from one of those decisions because we got to meet his wife, who is also a force of nature. Thank you. If you guys have questions, I am going to go home and go to bed soon. By the way, I did want to apologize. I had promised myself I would get my hair cut before doing this. And if my mom saw me, she would call me a communist. But then I saw Alan, and I thought somebody's got to show good hair. So anyway. So are there any questions or thoughts? Sorry I got emotional there. It's just fun stuff. Good stuff, meaningful. Annette.
What's your favorite story from? Is it that one?
Oh, absolutely. But I actually think, and I don't know if you'll agree with me on this, Annette, I think his greatest work overall, though, is Lord of the Hollow Dark. Right. I think it is better than, and I love all of his stuff, but I think it's even better than The Conservative Mind. I think it is his greatest work, and probably nobody knows it. It was his third novel, and it was published by a small publisher at the time, a publisher that wasn't doing that well, and it didn't get any play, and it's unfortunate. The problem with it is, and this is a good problem to have, what Kirk did in that story is he made a mythology around T.S. Eliot's characters. So every character who's ever shown up in a T.S. Eliot play or poem meets at this castle in Scotland for a weekend. And it's essentially, it's a study of sin, because they all carry with them certain sins. And it's a very dark novel. Deidre can tell you, when I was reading it for preparation of the book, I would only read it before noon on the deck in the summer if it was light out. And I stopped at noon because this stuff freaks me out. And that is by far, I think, Dr. Kirk's darkest work. And it has, I won't go into detail, you need to read it, but it is brilliant. And I just don't think, from my perspective, Annette, I think that was the height of his writing. Not that it went downhill from there, I don't mean that, but I think he really hit his great stride. That was 1979 that came out. I think it's a shame that that's not in print. I know Christendom republished it for a bit, but it's really hard to find. So Lord of the Hollow Dark is very good. It's as good as certainly any Bradbury I've read. I think it's equal to anything Bradbury wrote, including Fahrenheit 451 and Martian Chronicles. So, good. Anything else? Yes, Isaac.
As sort of students living in 2018 right now,
Sure.
what is the way that we can cultivate this kind of imagination?
Yeah.
Because it seems very difficult.
Yeah, we're all, I mean, I'm the same, even though I'm much older than you. We've all of us, last 20 years, we've been inundated with images. Yeah, everywhere, Twitter, Facebook, all the time. We see the news, and think about, I know we have very good people out there who are reporting, we've got a couple in the crowd who are doing extremely good and good things in journalism. But when even weather.com can lie and give us fake news, it's very dangerous. Right? We're just seeing these images all the time. And I think we're at a point right now, I don't want to be doom and gloom. I think there's hope. There's a lot of hope. But there's no doubt we're in a bad spot when it comes to our understanding of culture right now. I think for Kirk, imagine how he lived his life, and Leaves taught us this yesterday, right? Told us he had a position, he was tenure track. He could have been a professor at a major university, and he got offers all the time. University of Chicago made 4 offers to him. The University of Chicago. Right? He could have been there with Strauss, who was his friend. He could have been there with T.S. Eliot. He could have been there with all kinds of people. And Kirk said no, he wanted his independence. That takes a lot of courage. Right? That is really hard. I think Kirk always lived his own life. He always did what he thought. I mean, to the point of frustration, I bet, for some of his friends. I bet they were furious at times that Kirk only did what Kirk thought was right. I don't know if any of you've met Dr. Wilson, who was here for a very long time. He still lives in town, he's retired. But he used to say the funniest thing in the world was to try and watch somebody manage Dr. Kirk. Nobody could manage Dr. Kirk except for Annette. He's unmanageable. He's his own man. And there are a lot of people like that in that generation. Flannery O'Connor. Think about Willa Cather. Think about T.S. Eliot. These are all eccentrics. And we don't have that anymore. Our eccentrics aren't fun anymore. They're weird. And they're usually disgusting. That wasn't the truth in the 40s and 50s. In the 40s and 50s, you still had these interesting people, even on the left. C. Wright Mills, Jack Kerouac. You had really interesting people. We don't have that now. We have people who are famous, but they're famous for being idiots or for being famous. They're not famous for anything really interesting. And that, I think, is troubling. And that's something you have to work on. But I would also say this, and I think this is one of Kirk's greatest teachings as well. Kirk would never want any of you to be Kirkians. There's no such thing as a Kirkian. There's only you. And Kirk wants you to be you. He wants you, Isaac, to be the best Isaac you can be. So he is not, I admire him for this. It also means he doesn't have as many students as other people did. Yeah, you can be a Hayekian, and I love Hayek. He's one of my favorite thinkers. But you can be a Hayekian. You cannot be a Kirkian. It's not possible. Because once you're a Kirkian, you've blown it. You're no longer a Kirkian. That's the problem, because you're an individual. And so that, I think, is really, it's both great and it's hard for a lot of us. Especially, we want heroes, we want models. Kirk's basically saying, go do your own thing, just do it really well and be kind. So that's not always the easiest message to get across. So, yeah, it's great. Yes?
It seems like in the conservative mind, in the Bruce American order, Dr. Kirk does present us with a number of figures that he admired and that are heroic in many ways.
Sure.
In terms of their imagination, in terms of their writings, in terms of their ways of life. And so it seems like he's kind of pointing us, from Eliot to Burke to Hooker to the Schoolmen,
Sure.
Throughout the generations, there's this great tradition, there's this community of souls, and he's inviting us to be a part of that. And so you're talking about him as an individual and asking us to be individualists, but isn't he inviting us into that community of souls?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I appreciate that. I didn't mean individualist in the modern sense. I meant just being an individual, basically a person. Right, being a human, individual person. I shouldn't have said individualist, my apologies, because that's not what Kirk was doing. But you're right, he's asking us in our own eccentricities to be a part of the flourishing community. So he puts this, and I love the way he puts it, right? This is in part, the principle of proliferating variety, right? Each person being a new image. In so many ways, Kirk, even though he was not in any Christian church in the 50s, sounds as Christian as anybody will see in the 1960s, especially with his personalism. He's really anticipating a lot of what will be debated theologically in the 1960s, a full 10 years earlier. I don't know, I suspect that's in large part because of his connection with Regnery. Regnery was famous in the 40s and early 50s for publishing especially German authors and translating them, and a lot of great people like Romano Guardini and Gabriel Marcel, French, but a number of these people, and I think probably that's where Kirk got a lot of that, but I'm not positive. But there is definitely a strain of Christian humanism there that I think is very strong. So yes, thank you for that, and I think that's a very important corrective to make. Yeah. Yes, in the back. I'm sorry, I know we've met, I can't remember your name right now. You big guy in the back. Yes, you with Otter's Army. Yes. Oh, you didn't? Man. All right. I was actually bragging about you to my wife, even though I couldn't remember your name. So. All right. Anybody else? So you can tell me, what is your name?
Rob.
That's right. I knew that. Yes. Good. All right. Well, thank you all very much. I'm glad we got to celebrate that.
All right, thank you all for coming to this talk. Once more, just a round of applause for Dr. Birzer. All right, thank you guys so much for coming. I can say on behalf of the Dogwood Society here, and Caitlin, who's not here right now, and Dr. Porteous, that we're very grateful for everyone that came out. The Dogwood Society was founded in honor of Dr. Russell Kirk, as some of you know, and this was a great way to commemorate his centenary. So thank you, Annette, for coming. Thank you, Alan, Dr. Birzer, and Mr. Whitney. There are refreshments out in the lobby, or just outside. I think cookies, lemonade, and coffee. So enjoy yourself, and thank you for coming.